Welcome to the second program of October for the Dr. Harold Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. Again, this is our 23rd year, and we appreciate all the support that you've been doing for all these years. Mary Lou Gjernes is from North Dakota. For some reason, she moved to the D.C. area, and one day applied for a job and got accepted as the curator of the, I guess, assistant initially, and later for 30 years, the curator of the Army Art Collection. It's a great privilege to have you out, and this is a great story.
All right, Don, thank you very much for that kind introduction, for the opportunity to meet with this group. I'm probably related to half of you. I think I'm related to half of the city of Minneapolis, and it's always good to come home. And it's also good to be here at Fort Snelling. This is where my father was inducted into World War II, so this place has a soft spot in my heart as well. A colleague, Fred Voss, who is a historian and curator at the Museum of American Art at the Smithsonian Institution, once said that to paint something gave it a sense of importance or permanence. Early in World War II, a Virginia Congressman, A. Willis Robertson, said that we can take photographs of what happens, but it takes the vision and artistic skill of the artist to bring us the inspiration which only an artist can put down on canvas. Whenever anyone asks, with all these cameras, why do we still need art? That's the reason. An artist can give you a sense, a feeling that a photograph just can't duplicate. Well, I've been asked to talk a little bit tonight about the war art of World War II. And my choice of words is quite intentional. I know we've been talking a lot about the propaganda art, but I want to talk about a broader field. War art, for the purpose of our discussion this evening, is fine art. It's oils, watercolors, pen and ink or pencil drawings, made by soldiers on active duty on the front lines. Although many nations have collections of war art in their national military museums, I'm only going to talk about two of them tonight. The two collections it was my privilege to take care of for nearly 30 years, the German War Art Collection and the U.S. Army War Art Collection. A War Department Memorandum number 345-45, dated June 11, 1945, provided for the collection, processing, preservation, and control of war paintings, photographs, maps, trophies, relics, and objects of actual or potential historical interest or value produced during the war, which were or could become the property of the War Department. That covers a lot of territory. On November 8, 1945, a telegram was sent to the headquarters of the United States Forces European Theater and addressed to the theater historian. And this telegram suggested, as things from Washington suggest, the collection of available paintings, watercolors, engravings, and drawings showing troop activities, views of battlefields, military installations, industrial or home front activities produced by German or Italian artists during the war. Well, Title 10, the military government, you know, the military always has to have its regulations. Title 10, 18-401.5, states that all collections of works of art relating or dedicated to the perpetuation of German militarism or Nazism will be closed permanently and taken into custody. Gordon Gilkey, who was a captain in the intelligence section of the U.S. Army, was a young printmaker and teacher from Oregon. And he was given the assignment to do the collection. And it's his after-action report and an extensive interview between him and my predecessor, which is the source of much of what I'm going to talk about tonight. The German War Art Collection began to take shape in 1939. The program was a military program with artists attached to the staff of Pictorial Artists Propaganda Company. Based on artwork recovered after World War II, it would appear that the majority of German artists followed much the same kind of instructions as were given the American artists. Basically, it was very simple. Paint what you see, know, and experience. Well, prior to the invasion of Poland, studio paintings were being made by established Nazi artists using military subjects of World War I. Roman Feldmayer, for example, made a number of paintings showing German patrols and ruined buildings in and around Fromelles, France, where Hitler had boasted of his frontline experience in World War I. This is a painting of Fromelles, and it was painted in 1939. Otto Engelhardt Kiefhauser, a combat artist from World War I, continued painting these kinds of scenes, and this is historic feats of the German armed might called Assault at Armentières, 1918. Dr. Otto Blass, another World War I artist, painted this work of siege guns on the banks of the Weichsel River in Poland. Franz Eichhorst painted this study of soldiers in the trenches of World War I. Through all these, you can begin to see some of the emotion and the effort to stir up the emotions of the German folks. All of these paintings were trying to get a manifestation of the feelings of the time to get them stirred up. They were still very upset about the terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty at the end of World War I, felt they had been wronged, and the Nazi government was making a real effort to build on that fear and that anger. Well, with the entry of the Wehrmacht into Poland, German artist correspondence went along for commercial newspapers, syndicates, and magazines. Other newspaper artists at home improvised pictures to illustrate news flashes from the front. Nearly all the war pictures during this period were concerned with getting that spirit going to support the cause. And they also, of course, did a number of portraits at this time of the Nazi and military leaders. This is actually a 1937 painting by Elke Eber titled "Brown Shirts Take Over." Soldier artists on off-duty time or doing periods of monotony made pictures of some of their experiences just for their own amusement. Well, occasionally these were brought to the attention of a soldier's commander. There is a totally unattributed story that I tell you only because I love the story. There is absolutely no documentation for this. But the story is that one of the artist's work was brought to Adolf Hitler's attention. He was so impressed that he ordered the Oberkommando Wehrmacht to set up a staff of selected artists to follow the German military exploits. Well, Hitler designated the resulting works to hang in army museums and to decorate the club rooms and barracks of the permanent quarters of the victorious Wehrmacht units after the successful conclusion of the war. Hitler further decreed that the program would have professional supervision and not be left to the whims of his generals. Well, the Oberkommando Wehrmacht placed war painters and press artists in the Propaganda Replacement Center headquarters in Potsdam. The propaganda company to which the artists were assigned gave specific assignments in the field. Then the artists would come back to Potsdam where their work would be reviewed, and they would be sent home to work in their own studios to finish up the paintings. Each propaganda company had in its table of organization one artist and two advertising or commercial artists. The fine artist was thus subject to the understanding or incomprehension of the company Führer as to what his art activity should be. The propaganda company had to have pictures right away that could be used while it was still timely if it was going to meet the morning papers. These press sketches had to be made in a few moments by a skillful artist, and they may even depict situations that they were described through radio communication, many miles away from the front lines. This was a problem. Leupold Adam had been a war painter in World War I, and he came from a family of war painters. In June of 1941, he was assigned to the Propaganda Replacement Center in Potsdam, where he took charge of this group of war artists and press artists. Adam inherited a group but he really was not satisfied with the artists that he inherited because they were mostly press artists, 2 to 1. Adam wanted to get his artists out in the field where the action was going on and thereby be influenced by the feelings of the place and the time. A war painting requires conscientious preliminary studies and a sincere execution, as opposed to a press release sketch, which must be done very quickly. Later, Adam added photographic capability, a photographer who would photograph the artwork and make slides and photographic archives to be used by the press and in other publications. And you will see there in the archives, there are many publications, German publications, that always include some both press and war painter images. Well, Adam directed the Staffel der Bildenden Künstler out of headquarters of the military propaganda chief of the German Supreme Command, the Oberkommando Wehrmacht. This was a very highly placed organization. The artists that worked for Adam understood him, and he related to them because he himself had been a war artist, and he understood the working conditions of artists in combat. He was a representational painter, which was the kind of art that was officially recognized in Germany. He had a feeling for what the artists needed. Now, who were the artists? They were in uniform when they were at the front. Some of them had reserve commissions, so they were simply called back to active duty. There were some young ones, and there were some people in their 30s and 40s. And as I said, there were some veterans from World War I. Quite a number of them were art teachers in the various art academies that were still sanctioned by the Nazi government. Rudolf Hengstenberg was from the Bremen Academy. He did this one of a May Day celebration in Berlin in 1937. Arno Koning was from this Stadelkunst Institute in Frankfurt. And in March of 1943, he completed this oil painting of a flak hill in the Yalta of the Crimea. Theo Scharf was from the Munich Academy. He did, I'm showing you 2 paintings from his work. This is an assault crossing of the Dnieper River in Russia in 1941. And this is a Russian night fighter attack on Tatvasany, Russia, painted in 1945. Well, in the field, they were all basically under Adam's direction. And they were simply attached to the different armies or the Luftwaffe or to the Navy. The local commander, of course, when these artists showed up, knew full well they were on orders from Oberkommando Wehrmacht. And most of the time, he was very pleased to see them. He advocated that the war painters work at the front lines while the battle was in progress or immediately afterwards in order to make a true historical picture. The resulting works would thus have a much stronger effect on future audiences if the artist had experienced it himself rather than simply working from someone else's description. This is Surprising Fire from Allies on German Tanks by Helmut George in North Africa in 1942. Well, German troop morale would be raised by the presence of combat artists who they felt would be immortalizing the soldier and his most important contributions, his heroic deeds in the war. Adam obtained an order whereby artists with special ideas would be withdrawn from the propaganda companies and sent out by themselves on assignment. And this got some very interesting results. Rudolf Hansel spent the winter of 1941-42 with the Spanish mortar crew in Russia. This is the Spanish Blue Division near Novgorod. After the war, Adam told Gordon Gilkey that the artists sometimes got into some very sticky situations. The Russians or the US soldiers almost captured some of them because they would be out busily painting and not paying much attention to what was going on in the battle. And if it was going against the Germans, the troops, of course, would pack up and move, and sometimes the artists would get sort of left out front. There were some close calls, according to Adam. It was pretty obvious which paintings were made at the front and which ones were studio paintings. The artists were limited by the size of watercolor paper, sketch pads, and drawing paper that they could take to the front. And of course, they couldn't make large oil paintings or sculpture, so all of this was done back at the studio. And for a number of paintings, the artists just simply sat in the studio and created them out of their imagination. However, I do believe that this small pastel drawing depicting a machine gunner in cloister at Casino by Hervé Agricola, made in 1944, was done at the front. Agricola also did this small watercolor of a railroad gun used against Anzio beachhead in 1944. I like to think that perhaps it is the gun that our troops named Big Bertha. Well, the press artists were removed from Adam's supervision in the spring of 1942. Adam was asked to be the director of a Staffel de Beelden and Künstler with approximately 80 artists. Up to this time, only a few very well-known artists had been sent to the battlefront, plus the 16 propaganda company artists. The plan to strengthen the employment of artists on the extended front was encouraged and much supported by Adam. A unified direction of the use of artists at the right time and in the appropriate spot was desired, but until this time, not really obtainable because of the close work they had to do with the propaganda companies. Under this new plan, the artists would be allowed 3 months in a combat area, then report back to Potsdam where their sketches were registered. And one thing about the Germans is that they're very organized. The artists would then have 3 months to make finished studies from these sketches in their own studios. They were to bring back all the sketches, the oils, the watercolors, all the studies that they had done when their work was completed. At that point, they would be given a new assignment to a new front. In January of 1943, Adam moved his headquarters from Potsdam to Berlin and was able to expand the program. At the height of this operation, he had 100 to 120 artists all working at different fronts. So there's a lot of work going on here. In January 1943, a purchase commission was established with Erich von Fromberg as the chief. So now on regular intervals, the War Museum director in Berlin and elsewhere would all get together and look over all the drawings that the artists had brought in. The museum directors would commission larger paintings based on those drawings to highlight different sections of the campaign or different circumstances or events that they felt would be an asset to their museum's collections. And then the artist, when he had time, would turn these small illustrations into the large canvases. They were purchased by the War Museum, and some of the money was given to the artist for the additional work that he put into it. And some of it went to a special fund to expand the program. But I don't think the artist ever really saw any of the money. The artist got what amounted to overtime for the additional work and enlarging and expanding the theme, but they were already on salary to the Oberkommando Wehrmacht. And part of that salary, they received their supplies and they received all their travel. So this was simply an additional incentive for them to get some little extra overtime pay. Some of the larger paintings in the Army collections, and there are very large paintings of Hitler and his generals, or Göring and his generals, were made by studio painters, and the scenes that they depict never really happened. You couldn't get all of those generals, 16 or 20 of them together in one place long enough to stand for a portrait. But the paintings are roughly 8 by 10 feet. They were done for, there was an annual art show in Munich, and many of these pieces were on exhibit at the House of German Art. Here they were purchased, and many of them were actually purchased by Himmler and Hitler for their personal collections. The battlefield drawings or the paintings were a completely separate thing, although some of the artists served both. Franz Eichhorst, for example, painted some things from the campaign in Poland. This is a heavy artillery shelling Warsaw in 1939. And then he came back and worked in the studio for most of the rest of the war. Well, the paintings produced under this program were exhibited in Germany, Belgium, France, Poland, Norway, Italy, and Austria for educational and cultural purposes. Hitler had an exhibit of them in December 1943 at his field headquarters. Vienna had a comprehensive show, and one was held at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. There was also a German show staged at the Jeu de Paume in Paris, and given the French attitude towards the Germans at the time, I really don't understand why it was so poorly attended. Goebbels had a showing in January of 1945 at the Propaganda Ministry in Berlin, and this was the last show that the Germans hosted. The war officially ended for Germany in May 1945, and the Allied military government, with all of their regulations and directives, began its work. The Arts, Monuments, and Archives men moved in to recover the stolen artwork, the libraries, and the documents that Hitler had moved about Germany and taken for his own purposes. And Gordon Gilkey began to search for the German and Italian war art. Well, the search for this missing art took on characteristics of a massive treasure hunt. The paintings and sketches were scattered during the last chaotic days of the Third Reich, and they lay secreted in several widely dispersed and most unlikely repositories, the kind of thing that would send today's conservators completely up a wall. Some of the hiding places, as I said, were quite bizarre. One day, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section received information about a collection of war art, which they weren't interested in, which was located in Schloss Wingberg near Tagernies, Bavaria. Well, Gordon Gilkey set out to find the collection. He not only found the collection, he found the index to the collection. The collection turned out to be the Luftgau Kommando 6 Kunstfront, the Air Force's war at the front paintings. Some of the larger paintings acquired by Hitler in his shows in Munich had been moved from there in 1944 for safekeeping, and Gilkey found them in Bad Aussee. However, not all the pictures had reached that. He found that a truck had broken down en route from Salzburg. He traced the paintings to a second-floor dance room in a bar and grill in Agatha, Austria. The search for the Oberkommando Wehrmacht Staffel de Bildenden Künstler, the work that Adam was directing out of Berlin, turned out to be very successful. He not only found the collection, but he also found Adam, still carefully taking care of it. The collection had been put on a train. The train had left Berlin. They were checking all the trains that left Berlin from a month to before the end of the war to the very end. Discovered that the train, when finally located, had actually been strafed by the American Air Force. But fortunately, the bombs had missed the train cars that had the artwork in it. One of the few times I think that the Air Force missed its target. But the train was located, and it was found on the Czech border. This is where Gilkey found the collection and Adam. Adam was still taking care of it. He'd hidden a lot of it under the floorboards of a mountain cabin, and some of the rest of it in the basement of the Schloss Oberfenau. Unfortunately, although this was a beautiful castle on top of a hill, where he hid the artwork in the basement was also the home of a family of large mice. And so by the time Gilkey got to the collection, the mice had been eating at the edges of the paperwork. Other collections were located at the Haus der Deutschen Kunst in Munich, where they had been exhibited and not been able to be moved since the last exhibit. Some of the artwork had been moved to the basement of the Führerbauer in Königsplatz in Munich. At the Führerbauer, Gilkey found parts of the collections of Hitler, Himmler, and Bormann, as well as works from other offices of the Führerbauer area. This piece is called The Flag Bearer. It's Hitler in armor. It's by Hubert Lanzinger in 1934. Many World War II movies of the German headquarters, you will find depictions of this painting as backdrop in Hollywood scenes. Really latched onto it because it's a very graphic piece. This particular one, I can always tell when they've used a reproduction from the Army's art collection and not one of the reproductions that the Germans made. This one is damaged right in this area. This piece is an oil on cardboard. When the American troops found this piece, there was vandalism. One of the soldiers bayoneted the painting, and that's the damage that you see here. Just as an aside, it was a matter of great concern at one point when we were deciding how we were going to conserve this painting, because some of the black on the horse is not the best quality oil painting, and it was beginning to flake off, and the whole thing was beginning to look kind of shabby. But after much discussion, we decided that while we would conserve it, we would simply stabilize the break, because that was too much a part of the story of this particular painting. So it has been conserved, but the bayonet attack has been also preserved. Other museums in Munich yielded similar collections, and they included many portraits of Nazi and German military figures. It is an oil painting, but it almost looks like a photograph of Hitler and his personal staff in Munich in 1934, painted by Peter van Ham. Some of the paintings that were still in the hands of the artists were never recovered by Gilkey. Well, after 6 weeks of very diligent work, searching all over Germany and Italy, Captain Gilkey recovered thousands of pieces of artwork. But before packing them up for shipment to the United States, he selected 105 paintings for an exhibit sponsored by the Historical Division in the ruins of the Stadel Museum in Frankfurt on the Rhine. The exhibit was to open on December 6, 1945. In fact, it was opened by General Joseph T. McNary, who was commanding general, United States Forces European Theater, and by Colonel Harold E. Potter, who was chief of the Historical Division. During the afternoon of December 6th, the press representatives and photographers from major syndicates in the United States were escorted through the exhibit. And from December 7th through the 15th, the museum was open to American and Allied personnel. I find it interesting that they didn't invite any of the German folks. 1,500 people accepted the premise of no heat and no lights, during this very cold time in Frankfurt to see an exhibit. The exhibit was placed in the 3 remaining rooms of the museum that still had 4 walls. Following the exhibit, the collection was prepared for shipment to the United States. More than 9,000 items were placed in the custody of the Chief of Military History for permanent retention. At least that's what they said. Well, in the fall of 1950, legal ownership of the collection was questioned. The result was the screening of all the items in the collection. And approximately 1,600 were determined to be non-militaristic or non-political in nature and could be returned to the Federal Republic of Germany. The objects were shipped to the Historical Division, European Command in 1951 with the understanding that they would be returned by the German authorities to their rightful owners. The rightful owner in this instance was considered to be the artist. All the items were placed in storage in the Bavarian Hauptstädter archives in 1953. They are now part of the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, and from what we can tell from a number of folks who tried to find the collection in the 70s and 80s, the shipping crates were never opened. In 1981, a bill was introduced in the House of Representatives that authorized the Secretary of the Army to return to the Federal Republic of Germany certain works of art seized by the United States Army at the end of World War II. The bill, as finally passed by the Congress, required the Secretary of the Army to submit a list of artwork to be returned. A large committee of about 15 art historians and legal representatives, a lot of lawyers, from the Department of Defense and the Department of State actually went through the entire collection and produced the list. There were 5 criteria that the committee members used as a guide in making their review. Working on the premise that they would return everything except this criteria. Paintings which depict Nazi party emblems. This is a German forge by Ossech Wolf, actually painted in 1924. This is the Nazi people giving a Nazi Heil by Fritz Erler, painted in 1934. This is a German military service by Hans Schmitz-Weidenbruck, painted in 1941. And this is Hitler laying a wreath on the shrine of Nazi martyrs by Paul Hermann in 1942. Now, there were also paintings of the leaders of the Nazi hierarchy and convicted war criminals. I can't show them all to you, but this is Ortsgruppenleiter Brandhofer by Heinrich Knurr, painted in 1943. Knurr also had a favorite subject. He painted, I think by count, 16 portraits in the collection of Adolf Hitler. This one was done in 1939. Then there were the paintings whose overall impression was to glorify Nazism. This is an essay man rescuing a wounded member in a street fight by Otto Hermann Heuer, actually done in 1933. This is called In the Beginning Was the Word by Hermann Otto Heuer, 1937. The intense attention that is being paid is wonderful in this piece. This is called The Red Follower by Wilfred Nagel in 1942. It's a not too subtle attack on what the Germans thought of the Russian army. Well, the paintings that have received the most publicity were really not part of Leupold Adams' program. There was a young artist who went on to make a very different career for himself. The paintings were done before and during World War I. As Don mentioned, Adolf Hitler wanted to be an artist from a very young age. He applied to a number of art schools, and he even tried to sell some of his works on the street corners in Vienna before World War I. But looking at these 4 pieces, I have to wonder how the world might or might not have been different had he been more successful as an artist. This is a street in Vienna, 1914. This is an old court in Munich in 1914. We mentioned his World War I service. I used to tell people that this is what qualified him as a war artist, and therefore could be a legitimate part of the collection. This is a railroad embankment in Bioche-Saint-Vaast, which he has dated as of 3 May 1917. Oops. And this is the 4th one, Ruins of a Shelled Village, also 1917. There is some theory that, well, we know that he was wounded. He was actually gassed during his World War I experiences, and he did these pieces during part of his recovery. Confession time. I was a part of that committee that was going through this collection, and I realized that as a curator for the Army's art collection, I had a responsibility to tell the story of World War II as honestly from all sides as I could. But if all that I was left to work with from the German side of the program was this kind of material, I was really going to be hard-pressed to tell a story. So the committee agreed to let me pick out some pieces that I could use to tell the German side of World War II along with the American paintings that I was showing. So I was able to keep some paintings from the German collection. I showed you the piece of Agricola from Cassino. We have American paintings of Cassino. We also were able to show this is a soldier and war dog in the snow in Finland in 1944. We did not have American troops in Finland, but that was a front in the war, and if you're going to tell the whole story of World War II, you'd have got to include some of this. So it was going to take some careful labeling and interpretation, but I managed to keep a few pieces there as well. The task took a number of years. In 1985, a shipment of nearly 6,000 pieces of art was returned to Germany, specifically to the Bavarian Army Museum in Ingolstadt. The U.S. Army retained about 400 pieces. I had some interesting discussions with my friend, the curator of the Ingolstadt Museum, about these trucks that pulled up to his loading dock with all this work that he now had to catalog. Well, I mentioned in the beginning that I was going to talk about 2 collections that I had the privilege of working with. The second is the U.S. Army Art Collection. Beginning in 1917 with the U.S. entrance into World War I and continuing to the present war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. Army, as well as the other services, have continued the program of sending active duty soldier artists to the front lines to document and to paint the impressions and actions of the military personnel. The Special Services Division of the Adjutant General encouraged soldier art in the training camps as early as July of 1941. In fact, this program was actually an outgrowth of some projects of the federal WPA Federal Arts Program. In December, the Special Services Division wanted to expand the program. They knew what was going on. And the Army finally adopted a program in January of 42, giving the Chief of Engineers instructions to form a group of artists and, I love this, dispatch them to active theaters to paint war scenes. This is called Company in the Parlor by Joseph Hirsch, also Italy. And K. Ration's Bastogne, Belgium by Aaron Borod. They did frontline operations. This is called Hitting the Beach. It's the beach at Peleliu. It's painted by Tom Lee. This is actually a Marine battle. They did combat. This is a firefight over Algiers by Mitchell Saporin. Service support. This is a Radio Man by WWII. And It Takes Good Men and Machines, Germany, 1945, by Brocky Stevenson. And of course, artists must paint what they see around them. So characteristic views of the countryside was included in their instructions. This is Cherbourg, France, by Albert Gold in 1944. Well, the artists already in the field by August of 43, when Congress decided that they were going to cut off funding for the program. Military artists were simply reassigned. Many of them continued to produce artwork, although their official unit was disbanded. But Captain Ed Reep and his team were assigned to General Eisenhower's headquarters at Fifth Army, and General Eisenhower gave them the assignment to keep painting. So they accompanied the army from North Africa through Sicily and Italy. This is a piece called Artillery Position Above Luano by Savo Radulovic, and Launching the Truss for a Bridge by Ludwig Bacterian. I mentioned there was 19 civilian artists in this program, and they were really stranded. As civilians, they had contracts with the Army, which the Army had now broken. Life magazine came to their rescue and put them under contract. And if you go through issues of Life magazine from 1943, 44, 45, you'll see many of their work. But artists then like Ogden Pleisner, who had started out as one of those 19 artists with the military program in the Aleutians, was sent by Life magazine to Normandy. Fletcher Martin, another of the Life artists, did this view of Remagen Bridge in 1945. On December 7th, 1960, Life presented the collection to the Department of Defense. As I said, because it was Life magazine and not simply an Army program, it includes all services, Marines, Navy, and Army Air Corps. In late June of 44, Congress modified its position on military art and authorized soldier artists to produce artwork outside the continental United States as long as it didn't interfere with their regular duties. Well, the War Art Unit in the Pacific was reorganized with its original officers and headquartered in Manila. And its official duties were to paint. The unit covered events in the Philippines, China, Japan, and Korea until it was disbanded in 1946 when all the artists were discharged. This is the 112th Cavalry Patrol in Umtingala, and this is the Battle for Manila, both of them by Fred Vidar. Well, these two collections are not unique in the collections of military history. There are similar collections all around the world. I have been privileged in my career to see the paintings in Korea, in Canada, Great Britain, Australia, China, and Mongolia. And I know that there are incredible collections in Russia, France, and in Italy. I'm sure that in your travels around the world, you have seen many others as well. While each collection depicts the battlefield from the unique perspective of the artist, the war, the time, of the country that they were representing, there is a similarity in the experience of combat. There are the recurring motifs through all of these of battle, of training, of time with comrades, of times with local population, of times of loneliness and times of fear. I'm going to close with this image, painted by the current Army artist, following a trip he made to Afghanistan. The feelings don't change for the frontline soldier. Only the uniform, the equipment, and the geography. One bit of propaganda myself. Someone asked me earlier where you could see some more paintings from this collection, where it was shown. The Center of Military History does not yet have an art gallery open to the public. However, paintings are on exhibit in traveling exhibits throughout the Army and a number of public museums as well. And on the Army webpage, the U.S. Army Center of Military History has a link to many of the pieces in the collection, and they actually run changing exhibits on that webpage. So I invite you to take a look at the webpage there. That's all I have to say in my prepared remarks. If there are any questions.
Mary Lou, when I was at Neuschwanstein on one of the trips, I was told that there was art that was stored at Neuschwanstein, and I also was told by one of the guides, the docents, that it was not. What's the story?
How do I phrase this?
The truth.
It was there.
It was there. Okay.
It was there.
And as I recall, that there were large caches found in some of the salt mines.
Yes.
Where were the salt mines that this was?
They were along that border, the Czech border. They also, a lot of the soldier art was intermingled with some of the fine art museum collections that were hidden in those same salt mines. And so it was a matter of figuring out what went where.
One of the numbers that I wanted to ask you, the collection that the U.S. Army has currently in its total inventory in Washington or on, could you give us that number?
It's about 12 to 13,000
pieces.
And 400 of them are German. The rest are American pieces.
So the German collection went from 9,000 down to 400. And what happened to the 8,600 that ended up back in Germany?
It went to the Ingolstadt, the Bavarian Army Museum in Ingolstadt.
But that's an American,
No.
right? It's a German.
No, that's a German museum. And it's been incorporated into the German military.
How many Italian pieces were
Gilkey
brought?
never found any Italian pieces.
Really? I don't know
That
if
doesn't mean they weren't there. He just never found them.
Did the Japanese have an art program?
Yes, they did. It wasn't as extensive, apparently, as the German program. But we did have a collection group went out, and actually the Japanese had, thinking to protect their collection, sent it to Korea. And the detectives, the Army intelligence officer detectives, tracked that collection to Korea and brought several hundred pieces back to Washington, but they were returned to Japan in the late 60s.
So those were not propaganda type things? Not as blatant as the Nazis?
Not as blatant. I saw photographs of them. But they weren't quite as blatant, and it may be a cultural thing. It may be that we just didn't understand what the Japanese propaganda was.
Was trying to do.
Or the people who were looking at the collections didn't.
Now, the one of the things that of the German pieces that you showed this evening, was the first part of those part of the art that was returned to Germany?
No. All of the pieces that I've shown you tonight, we kept.
We did keep those.
Yeah.
Well, some of those look like they could have arguably been returned.
Well, that's part of the 200 that I managed to keep to show a balance for both sides of the war.
The big the railroad cannon and things like that. Interesting. Interesting. Well, listen, are there any other questions? And
Yes.
How did the Soviets treat this art? Did they have similar organizations as yours, and did they preserve the art?
Yes, they did. It's the short answer. Yes, they did. It was a little more. Well, no, it really wasn't. It was pretty much the same type of thing. They didn't have as extensive a program because they had more economic problems and were under bombardment, for extended periods of time. But they did have a program, and it is, I believe, in St. Petersburg.
Open to the public?
No. Most of these collections, unfortunately, are on bases that you need a lot of security to get into. Yes, sir.
Speaking of Russia, do you have any theories as to what might have happened to the Amber Room that was taken out of a palace near Leningrad?
I have no idea. There are a lot of theories floating around. I fear that it was probably destroyed in a bombing raid, but I really have no idea. I would love to know what happened to that collection. There's another one out of Dresden that I would love to know what happened to it also. Wonderful collection that was taken out of Dresden. No, just of art in general.
all right, well, that was probably destroyed by the bombing of Dresden. Yeah. Yes, question?
Yes, I have a two-part question. My understanding as far as the German pieces that were retained is that they depicted certain elements of Nazism that you had concerns about as far as returning that to Germany. Are there any plans then to at some point display that art, or would that be kind of going against why the art was not returned to Germany in the first place? And the second part of my question is, has Germany made any recent demands for a return of that art?
I'll answer the second part of your question first, because it's shorter. To the best of my knowledge, no, they haven't. There are still, and this was part of the consideration that the committee as well, is that there are still on the books in Germany some very strong laws concerning the display of any kind of Nazi symbolism. And that was one of the things that the committee took into consideration. The first part of your question about the exhibition, the U.S. Army has never really hidden the collection. We have been willing to display it. Even the Hitler watercolors have been displayed. The only concern is how they are displayed. In context, you can learn a great deal about what was going on in Germany, German thinking, German attitudes towards the war. But the exhibition has to be well balanced. It's always been the fear that the certain pieces could be used to re-glorify the situation, and we don't want the U.S. Army to be a part of that. So yes, they have been displayed, and certainly are available in context.
Yeah,
Okay.
one of the things that, and correct my accuracy, there were the denazification laws that were
Yes.
passed at the end of the war that really prevented members of the Nazi Party from holding key political and governmental positions. And there were some people that got in deep trouble because they said, if a guy can drive a streetcar, even if he wore a Nazi pin, we need streetcar drivers. But I think the thing that's sensitive is really the Nazi swastika, and that is forbidden.
Absolutely forbidden.
And there are a lot of buildings. When I served at UCOM headquarters back in the late 80s, they had these frescoes of the German art, but you could see how they had patched over the symbology of the party itself. Question here, yes, sir.
A lot of the paintings you showed on the American collection had dead and wounded in the pictures, but none of the Germans did. Were they under some sort of restriction that they could not show dead or wounded soldiers, or was that just a matter of how you selected it?
I don't think they're under any specific instructions. They just didn't. The artist just didn't see it.
So it was a cultural thing, or
I think it was just artist selective decision. I know that our artists are not given any instructions about that at all, and there are some paintings in the collection that have a lot of dead bodies in them. Some of them are very, very hard to look at, but again, if you do it in context, it makes sense.
If I can just add something to that, this is from the war photographers. The German war photographers did take photographs of dead soldiers, and those things were censored by the propaganda ministry. So I don't know, maybe that has a reflection on the art too.
Probably, because the same people who were going over the photographs also looked at the sketches.
Say, just a question that came up, actually, a great point. Were these, you said there were 19 propaganda teams?
16.
16 propaganda teams. That chain of command going up, did that fall under Goebbels as a propaganda minister? So he delegated that into
Right.
Political and then military
Right.
as the organization. Okay. Any other? Oh, yes, sir.
Why do you think the Germans wanted the art back if they're not displaying it to the public?
I think it was they were beginning to, for the first time, really look at their own history of World War II. Until the late 70s, early 80s, they had sort of tried not to think about it. But during that period, they began to look at what was really, their part in World War II. And I think getting the artwork returned was sort of a way of perhaps even quieting some of the agitation that was going on in Germany for the return of the paintings. The request, as it was given to the State Department, was sort of, well, gee, kind of maybe if you don't have anything else to do with it and you'd like to get rid of it, we could maybe sort of be willing to take it off your hands. It's kind of how the request came to the State Department. And of course, our politicians said, of course, we'll give it to you.
Well, listen, we're going to end it at this point. Mary Lou, thank you for coming back home.
Thank you very much for having me.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.